Thank you to Eric Jay Dolin, who is here today to talk with me about why he wrote Left for Dead up here on the shelf. And this book is the latest in a stellar line of maritime histories by Eric that are set in the era of the sailing ship with stalwart captains and pirates and whaling expeditions and war, and occasionally shipwreck and treachery. So
Yes.
thank you, Eric.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's just dive right into this super enticing title, especially for a nonfiction book. It's not just Left for Dead, which is already gripping, but the subtitle is Shipwreck,
Right.
Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. I feel like that should cue some dramatic music at the start of a movie. So
Yeah.
I wanted to just, rather than start with a pretty complicated plot line of real life
Right.
from more than 200 years ago, I want to start just by asking you if you were pitching your book, if Left for Dead was, up for consideration as a possible film, how would you
Mhm.
pitch it? What would be three of the top thrilling episodes that you would say would be important in a movie called Left for Dead?
Right. Let me preface this by saying that part of the reason that I write books is so I could spend page after page describing exactly what I find so exciting about the topic. So getting an elevator pitch or a quick pitch is not necessarily my strong point, but I'll give it a shot. The three things that I'd probably focus on is one is the most dramatic is when Charles Barnard, the captain of the sealing vessel Nanina, and four other men, two British men, well, three British men and one American were basically abandoned in the Falkland Islands. So I would focus on the moment that these five men came back in their whaleboat to New Island, where they thought their ship was, where Charles Barnard's ship was, only to find that it had disappeared and they had been potentially left alone or marooned. And then the episode would really go on for the next couple of days when they valiantly tried to sail their whaleboat all the way to Eagle Island, about 80 to 90 miles away, where they hoped that the British castaways who they had agreed to save initially were still there and were getting ready to leave the islands on the ship. So that is just an incredibly cinematic scene. They spend days sailing scores of miles in the middle of winter, making mistakes, landing in places they didn't expect to or didn't quite know where they were, and finally giving up and realizing the horrific truth is that they were intentionally, apparently, marooned on the Falkland Islands in the midst of winter, and they had absolutely no idea why this horrific fate had befallen them. And I think that's one of the worst things. It's bad enough to be left if you know the reason, but to be left and have no idea why this turn of events could have taken place is just absolutely mind-boggling. Another scene that I thought was particularly gripping is when the British castaways from the British brig Isabella, who crashed onto Eagle Island, they quickly decided to send off their 17 and a half foot longboat to get rescued, essentially find help. And this longboat with six men on board spends a couple of days fruitlessly wandering around the Falkland Islands looking for any settlements that might be there. And there were no settlements. They didn't know that at the time. During this wandering, the boat almost capsizes. Another time, the boat drifts off, and it was only because one of the men who was able to swim jumped into the water and grabbed the painter or the rope of the boat that it didn't go off into the wide open ocean, which would have been perhaps the end of them. But really, the most exciting part of that venture is that after a few days of wandering around the Falkland Islands, they decided to do the second part of what they had agreed to, which is to sail from the Falklands all the way to Buenos Aires, where they knew that there was a British warship on station to hopefully get help and a rescue mission. And they made it the 1,200 miles in a small boat at one time, almost being upset by a whale. But they finally made it there. And then when they landed in Montevideo on the South American continent, they didn't know it before they got there, but they landed right in the middle of a revolution. So they had to deal with soldiers and the like. And eventually they got safe passage to Buenos Aires, where the captain of the British warship, a guy named Peter Heywood, the captain of the Nereus, decided, okay, I'm going to send a warship, the Nancy, captained by this guy, William Peter Duranda, down to the Falkland Islands to rescue the 50 or so British castaways that were still there. And then probably the third most dramatic episode in the book is when Charles Barnard, who's with these four other men, after a number of months together, the four other men conspire, in effect, to leave Charles Barnard alone on New Island, taking the boat, taking almost everything he had, and most importantly to him, taking his treasured dog Scent with them. So Charles Barnard, not only was he marooned originally with the five men, but he was also marooned totally on his own, becoming a real life Robinson Crusoe for about 2 months. So just a lot of amazing episodes in the book, I think. And a number of people have said it should be made into a movie. I'm not holding my breath. I've had other of my books optioned for different things or talked about as being made into a movie or a documentary, but nothing's happened yet. But if any of them get made into a movie, I think this one and the one that I have coming out in June, maybe they're the most likely candidates. But I'm not holding my breath.
Well, that was a great pitch. So I vote for the movie. Good luck with that, Eric.
Okay.
I think all of the scenes that you just described are so visceral and cinematic, and you can just envision, even if you don't know the kind of detail that you know about how these
Mhm.
various kinds of boats, from whaling boats and longboats to the sailing ship itself, actually work, and you do a terrific job showing them and explaining that. But yes, my sympathy with all of these sailors was at an all-time high in the episodes that you describe, and the suspense was terrific. So that
Thanks.
shipwreck and treachery and survival really is very gripping. So that brings me to my next question and a lot of curiosity that I have about these men. And I have to say, you kind of disclosed this very early in the introduction to the book. So uh, you say right there that after surviving all this like crazy, horrific, heroic in some cases, and cowardly and treacherous in other cases, events, and the survival they had to endure that for not just months, but almost 2 years, so well over a year and
Right.
a half. But then you said, well, after they did get rescued, and spoiler here, but they did get rescued, and their journals to some extent were recovered. It didn't seem to they didn't make much of a mark in the world. And in particular,
Right.
what surprised me the most, Eric, is it didn't seem to change them very much. So, so did uh, why do you think that was so? And then I also, as the story unwound in that way, uh, and for a variety of reasons, I found myself not really liking any of them very much. So I want to know from you, the author and to some extent recreator of the story,
Right.
did you like any of the characters? Who did you like or dislike in the book?
Well, before I get to that, the first part of your question was interesting. Do I identify with any of the book's characters, and it sounds to me like you're sort of asking me because I mentioned that nobody involved left much of a mark on the world. So you're basically asking me, am I going Eric Dolan going to leave much of a mark on the world? Well, I'd like to think that through my writing, maybe my life will live on beyond me. But the real truth is, when you look at history, history may be depicted as a bunch of great men or women doing things that are emblazoned in our collective memory, but most people live kind of quiet lives, even if they have dramatic events in their lives. After they're gone, the world doesn't really remember them. There was a little bit of news coverage when the events unfolded and after they got back, but all of these men were not the kind of historical figures that you uh, think about it. In fact, it was just me finding this story and bringing it back to life. And I guarantee before this book came out, you would be hard pressed to find anybody out there, even somebody who's interested in maritime history, who knew about this story. It was just one of the many stories that took place in the 1900s that have disappeared in the mists of time. But as to whether or not I liked or disliked them, no, a lot of them I didn't like very much. Captain Charles Barnard was sort of an arrogant bully during much of the events that transpired. William Duranda, the captain of the Nancy, he was dishonorable, I think, not empathetic, and a little bit greedy. Samuel Ansell, one of the men who stayed with Charles Barnard, was a real nasty piece of work. I didn't like the British castaways as a whole because when Captain Duranda came down to save them and discovered that there was an American sealing ship and a bunch of Americans. This is during the War of 1812. Instead of agreeing to the deal that had been made between the British castaways and the Americans, that the Americans would save them, he ripped up that agreement and he basically made all of the Americans prisoners of war and took their ship as a prize of war. So I felt that was particularly a despicable action on his part. I kind of like Charles' father, Valentine, at 63 years old. He was a pretty old guy to go on this ship, and he seemed to be a calming influence during at least part of the story. I like Captain Peter Haywood, the captain of the HMS Nereus, the one who decided to send the Nancy and the rescue mission to the Falklands. I thought he was an empathetic character. And then, of course, I like the dog Scent in the book. Everybody seems to like the dog Scent. He was a very good dog, as they say. But it is tough. A lot of the characters I didn't particularly like. But I think that, and I think this might be your next question. They evolved. I remember one of the things we talked about before is did they change? Or you asked, did they change very much? And I think some of them had an arc. They say some wise philosopher. A lot of people sort of ascribe it to Albert Einstein, but it's not true. Somebody before him, a philosopher whose name has been lost to the mists of time, said that adversity introduces a man to himself. And you can insert women, but most of the characters in this book were men. And I believe there's some indication of that. But unfortunately, for a lot of the people in this book, when adversity came up, the introduction to themselves was not particularly salubrious. They sort of amplified some of their bad features. But Charles Barnard, I think, experienced some growth. He was an arrogant bully to begin the book, but once he was marooned on the Falklands, I think he took up a pretty admirable leadership role and he showed some compassion and some growth, self-serving though it may have been, since he's the main person who wrote about the events down there. Jacob Green, the Black American seaman who was on the Nanina with Charles Barnard, I think is portrayed throughout the book and throughout the story as a pretty good guy, a very competent seaman. I am puzzled, given the description of him and some of the actions that he took in the book, that he ultimately decided to go with the other four men and maroon or abandon Charles Barnard. And if I could get him to have a drink with me, I would ask him why he did that instead of fighting back, because at other times in the book, he actually fought back against bullies. Ansell, one of the British sailors, the ones who convinced everybody to abandon Barnard, he experienced a little bit of a change because he was chastised because finally everybody realized that he's a real SOB, and they marooned him on his own island and he was having a tough time surviving. And when they finally decided upon compassion and they brought him back into the fold, he seemed to be a little bit of a changed man. At a minimum, he didn't cause any trouble from then on out. So there was some growth, and I didn't really think about it that way when I was writing it. I didn't think, oh, I hate all these characters. But a lot of the characters that I didn't like, it actually sometimes makes writing a little bit easier. If overall the story didn't have an interesting ending, that wouldn't have been the case. And I know that David McCullough used to say that you really can't write a biography about somebody that you despise. I'm not sure I agree with that 100%. However, there is one book in my past, I can't tell you what the topic was. I started writing it and it was so painful that I actually, after having a contract to write a book, I said, I can't write this book. I got to pick another topic. And I did. So it's happened to me. But none of these people in this book were so heinous, and the story was in such a way that at any time did I think, oh, this is not the book I want to write. I really enjoyed writing the book and learning about the Falklands and learning about the failures of human beings when put in trying circumstances.
Well, that's a good leading question for me. I can ask you without it seeming like I'm trying to just throw you hard balls here, because I'm not. I'm just really
They're good
curious.
questions.
So, you're the author. You
Yep.
spent a lot of time, and you're an amazing researcher, Eric, which I know from reading this book and your prior books. You just go into such detail and you read every document you can get your hands on, and you clearly enjoy that. You enjoy diving into the archives and the historical record and coming up with the things that you want your readers to pay attention to and learn from your
Yeah.
book. So now I'm here to ask you, in this case, you did decide to keep going. You Oh, I love the story that you actually had a contract that you didn't feel you could write the book. That's
Yes.
wonderful. And I won't press for more details. It sounds like you can't give them, but that's interesting to realize that that
Yeah.
happens. In this case, you said you enjoyed the writing. What did you personally learn? Did you have any insights or thoughts about what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to behave in a treacherous way under pressure? Anything you took away from the book into your own personal life?
Uh, yeah, I mean, some of it might be via osmosis that I'm not aware of yet. Every book that I write has some impact on me, if not, if only for having a new bunch of information in my head. But this book sort of painted a broad picture of humanity and the extremes. There are people capable of great compassion and fortitude, but there are also people capable of great meanness and cowardice. And I think you see both of those extremes in the book. And I like to think that on balance, good wins out over evil. But given my understanding of history, all the way up until the present, I am not sure that's the case. I often wobble in that perception. But I also, one way that affected me, I did try to think about what would I have done in that situation. If
Mhm.
I was one of the British castaways, would I have stood up to a captain of a British warship who basically told me, no, we're going to take this American ship as a prize and all the Americans are going to become prisoners of war, despite the fact that they were very kind, the Americans, and they agreed to forego the rest of their sealing voyage to save all of us castaways? Would I have stood up against the face of power? I'd like to think I would have, but I don't know because I wasn't in that situation. I'd like to think that if I was marooned in the Falkland Islands, I would have enough ingenuity and fortitude to survive for 534 days. I think it would be much more difficult for me than it was for these
Mhm.
gentlemen because they were mariners to begin with, and Charles Barnard had been in the Falkland Islands before, and they're very, they're people who had a lot of skill in surviving and dealing with the outdoors and dealing with ships.
I know you don't write novels. I don't know if you're even tempted to think about writing novels ever. Uh,
Well,
but
well,
would you change the ending
oh,
at all if it were a novel
oh,
to kind
all
of
right.
emphasize something? about the what
I,
the arc of the story meant morally, perhaps, rather than just historically.
Perhaps. I once did write a novel. I wrote a murder mystery, and my agent read it, and he basically said, and he's represented some pretty big mystery writers. He said, stick to nonfiction, Eric. So I didn't pursue that too much. It's not my natural inclination. But I think you have to look at it two different ways. People, I think, naturally try to make themselves look better than they were, unfortunately. And that's one of the difficulties when writing history. You want to get multiple perspectives. The only reason I was able to show Charles Barnard as being an arrogant bully is certainly not from the way he wrote things. He comes out smelling like a rose. But fortunately, there were other journals that were written by other observers who said, hey, including his father, who said, he was a real pain, this guy. So you have to have multiple perspectives to tell as full of a story as possible.
And you found all these journals and all these different
Yeah.
perspectives, and that juxtaposition of those perspectives throughout was fascinating, really
Mm,
fascinating. I mean,
good.
it's one of the things that just for its shock value, and you did beautifully in mentioning it as uh, kind of an early pointer at watch out for Charles Barnard. He's not the guy that you want to be maybe left on a deserted island
Yeah.
with. Was when he threw the ship cat overboard.
Yeah. Yes. That was horrible.
That was
When
just like, whoa,
I
this
remember
is
reading the
not a
journal.
hero. This is, and
Uh,
he's remorseless, right? Just like, oh,
yeah.
annoying, and get rid of the
I remember when I read that sentence, it was in a journal kept by one of his men, the
right.
ship's journal. And it was just a one or two, sentence, just, oh, the captain got upset that they threw the cat overboard. And I remember reading that going, oh, that's horrible. But he
Yes.
had a real soft spot for his dog, and his dog was a wonderful dog. And I know you were curious about that. I wish I knew more about Scent, what breed he was, more about what happened afterwards. I couldn't find much of anything about what happened to him, but I can tell you, given the number of questions I got from readers about Scent, if I could have written an entire book about Scent, it would have been a mega bestseller and a major motion picture right now. People love dogs, they love dog stories, and I wish I could have had even more about him in the book.
Yes, well, that was my question. Were you tempted to keep the spotlight more on the dog
Uh,
because the dog was unambiguously heroic and positive? I know that you're very scrupulous about
right.
holding that line.
Right. Well, that's a really good point. I am. I am very, as people who know me, I am very literal, and I try to tell the story as straight as I can. There, of course, any history, no matter how much you hew to the documents, there's a certain element of subjectiveness just in the fact that you have to pick certain facts to include. But there has been a trend in the last 10 or 20 years, as you know, there are a number of histories that sort of bend the rules a little bit. And there are people that write quote unquote histories that you see in the nonfiction section that add dialogue that never was transcribed in contemporary documents. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. It's just not my style. And I try to keep to exactly what I know. I can speculate. And if I speculate, I'll say I'm speculating.
Well, two wrap-up questions for you.
Yeah.
One is you've already said that sometimes the impact of having written a book takes a while after you finish and publish the book to really become obvious to you.
Right.
Uh, from this perspective, this book has been out now for a year, year and a half.
Yeah.
And what were the memorable rewards from your point of view as an author who did a huge amount of research and brought this story to life, and now it's out there in the world? What intrinsic reward did that have for you? What kept you going throughout?
Well, slightly different questions. What kept me going throughout is I had a contract, I had a deadline, I need to earn some money to help my family. And I love writing, I love completing something. I've been a full-time writer since 2007. It's what I love to do. And I'm very, not only am I a very literal writer or sticking to the facts, I'm also pretty good at keeping the deadlines. Deadlines help me focus my attention. I like telling the story, and I get excited when chapter after chapter starts to develop and I can see exactly where it's going and whether it sounds exciting to me that I'm telling this story. But then after the book comes out, uh, there are a couple of things that make me excited. So the one metric is the book does well, and my books usually do well. I've never had a mega blockbuster. It'd be nice to have one before I kick the can, but it's okay. I'm very happy with my career. So the book did well. A lot of people bought it. And the second thing that's related to that that really makes me happy is occasionally, not once occasionally, I get emails from readers, not just reading reviews. But I get emails from readers or I meet people at talks and they say, I really enjoyed the book. And I can't tell you how happy that makes me because I feel like I've had an impact.
Another metric for the success of any book is what impact it has on the readers.
Right.
Those people who do buy the book, take the time to read the book, reflect on it. What are they going to remember about the book? They won't remember all the ins and outs. So, you as an author, what do you want them to remember, and what do you hope they will remember years after they finish reading Left for Dead?
Well, the first one is never travel to the Falkland Islands in a relatively small wooden boat, especially in winter. That's one. But more seriously, I would say that even people who aren't successes by whatever metric you define success, even the people who don't leave a big mark on the world, who aren't the movers and shakers, can have scenes or episodes in their life that are truly epic and fascinating. And and sometimes writers come along like me to uncover those and bring them back to life. I think that there are noble things in everybody's life. There are great passages in everybody's life. And I like finding the stories of people who are not the ones that everybody talks about. I'm really trying to just get the reader to have a thrilling ride through history. And they can, in reading it, there are a lot of questions that'll come up and they'll have to ask themselves, such as, how would I have behaved? Would I have done anything differently? Is all fair in love and war, which is sort of the attitude that Captain Duranda took. Also, what does it take to survive? Now, this is a different era, but you're always asking those questions. What does it take to survive if you're in adverse circumstances? So those are some of the things that I think readers will take away from it.
They did survive.
They did
So,
survive. Yes.
in various ways, some more admirable than others, they did
Yes.
what they needed to do in
Mhm.
order to survive. And
Right.
you're showing that slice of a life that went on to achieve or not achieve many other things, but they came through this experience left for dead and back alive. So
Yes.
on that happy note,
Yeah.
thank you again, Eric J.
Sure.
Dolin. And
Thanks.
it's been a pleasure talking to you about why you wrote Left for Dead.